Good afternoon. Welcome to this session of our 2026 Spring Faculty Forum. And my name is Heather Johnson-Schmitz. I'm the Manager of Grants and Contracts in the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, the host. And today I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Matt Meyer as our speaker, and on the topic of AI and our humanity, technological thoughtlessness. Dr. Meyer is a professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. And he's written on the human condition, on philosophy and pop culture. And he's currently working on a book titled On Thoughtlessness, an Existential Analysis. He's interested in the intersections of AI, humanity, and ethics, and he's currently teaching a course in philosophy of AI this semester. So a couple of just technical things before I turn things over. We will have some time after the presentation for questions. We do have some viewers on Zoom, so we welcome you Zoom folks to submit your questions. There's a Q&A button near the bottom, and our most excellent graduate assistant, Ethan, will read those out. And then Dr. Meyer, I'll just ask you to restate
for sure
any questions for the benefit of our Zoom guests. Please welcome and join me in welcoming.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I do really appreciate it. So a couple of caveats up front is that, as I'm sure you're aware, there are so many things that we could be talking about in a talk entitled Artificial Intelligence and Our Humanity. What I'm going to do is try and keep the first part of the talk like a little bit light so that I could get to the more abstract stuff that I'm interested in. But even in the beginning here, I'm going to be talking about some philosophical arguments and points that ethicists and philosophers of AI have concerns about. So I think there's ultimately two views out there, maybe a continuum would be a better way of putting it, about the promises and perils of AI. Both sides almost always acknowledge that there are both promises and perils, but I thought that these two works give a good sense of the extremes, right? So on the one hand, you have If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies by Eliezer Yudowsky and Nate Soares. And on the other hand, you have Deep Utopia, Life in a Solved World by Nick Bostrom. Both of them are essentially telling us where this artificial general intelligence or super intelligence might take us. Now, I will say, and this is part of the case I'm going to be making later, is that the title Deep Utopia kind of betrays, it gives the wrong message about what Nick Bostrom is actually interested in that book. Considering here is like, even if AI goes really well, we kind of avoid the worst part of the kind of physical short-term immediate risks. What about the kind of long-term moral risks? So I've divided the risks here into two types. The existential risk list is not intended to be exhaustive by any means, but it's just a start, right? So imagine that human beings are using the AI for nefarious purposes, right? So technically, Bostrom's going to be calling this like a two-agent type situation where you have the human agent using the AI agent to do things on its behalf, right? And serious threats there include like mass disinformation that can change elections and things like that. Already there's a serious problem with telling deepfakes apart from real videos about public figures, so that's coming. And then the potential of bioweapons. I remember listening to, I think his last name is pronounced Suleiman, a former Google worker, wrote a book called The Coming Wave. And in there, there's already a couple books old, in there he's sort of citing the fact that like, yeah, you can actually buy a machine that's capable of like modifying genes for your garage lab, basically, for like $25,000. Now you inject this thing with the power of machine learning and massive intelligence, and that could create real problems for rogue nefarious actors. Mass job displacement, I guess I would argue that if we don't have some plan for the way that we can transition people who are working in kind of mid-level white collar jobs that seem to be the most at risk for AI displacement in the near future, if we don't have a plan for that, that could wind up being very, very bad almost across the globe. Then we'll talk about a slightly more abstract problem, the alignment problem, the control problem, that are basically behind some of those initial problems. And then there's a whole list of like moral, or what I really like someone else calls this asymptomatic problems. Why are they asymptomatic? Because the kind of shifting, as sometimes called behavioral drift, is so slow that it doesn't kind of appear as a problem until it's almost too late, right? Of course, people are always going to argue whether or not these are problems, but like consider the fact that before we all had cell phones, I'll even go back to dumb phones. So this isn't a point about social media or anything. This is just a point about memory. Before we had phones in which we could store our contact information, we had to memorize, I don't know, 9, maybe 30 important numbers to us, right? And then just be able to kind of, use those numbers when we needed them, right? Of course, if you had more than that, you had a little book with you or whatever the case might be, right? But as soon as we have cell phones and then smartphones where we can enter this contact information, right? We no longer need to use those kind of memory, and here being metaphorical, but those memory muscles, right? And so that whole ability for us to sort of do those things goes away. Because this was so gradual, right? We didn't realize that it was happening while it was happening. But now if you ask, an average Gen Zer, like, how many phone numbers do you have memorized? They would maybe say 1, right? Now, again, like you could push back against that and say, okay, well, maybe that isn't a problem. It very obviously becomes a problem if the kind of infrastructure that holds that memory for us collapses, right? But maybe until that point, it's not so much of a problem. But here we have several like kind of more distant and worrisome problems. And yes, I threw this term in the title because I don't want to say it's like my unique contribution, but it's an idea that I'm working with. That I think is fascinating and problematic. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about all of this. I'm merely going to show you that this was back in 2022, before even the latest LLMs that are creating all the kerfuffle about the potential for super general intelligence were even around. This was a kind of map drawn up by Bostrom and others as to the various possible negative outcomes of a kind of super general intelligence. So you have, of course, like AI racing against other AI to, consume the most data and information. You have the use of AI in great other state power wars, corporate lobbying and environmental regulation. One thing that environmentalists and sustainability experts are really sort of like trying to make the case for now, and there's some indication that this might change as these systems become more efficient and less energy consumptive. But so right now, training one large AI model can consume the equivalent of 5 times the lifetime emissions of an average US car. That's the training, that's not the use. And so people say, well, we're not training as much as we used to. Maybe this won't be so bad. It's also the case that people have estimated that writing one query for a 100-word email uses the equivalent of a bottle of water in terms of cooling, water for cooling consumption. Another sort of like recent case that comes to mind with the potential existential risks of AI use in warfare is that there's a great likelihood that the Tomahawk missile that accidentally hit the Iranian girls' school was run on Palantir Maven, which was run on Claude Anthropic, right, as part of this AI-generated target package. And so, in just war theory, we talk about the principle of discrimination, where you want to make darn sure that you are discriminating between combatants and non-combatants. And essentially, when we are giving over that entire process to AI data analysis, that can be very problematic. And of course, as people have pointed out, like, who's accountable there, right? Because the AI can't really, I mean, we could talk about possible ways that could look, but the AI can't really be accountable in the sense that someone else could be accountable. So do we hold someone at Palantir accountable? Do we hold someone at Claude accountable? So in terms of mass job displacement, this was diagram drawn up by Lee and Shifan, who wrote a book called AI 2041 back in AI 2021. So like, or AI 20, back in 2021. So another interesting thing is like the way that researchers in these areas have this kind of futural thinking, right? This was also before the mass LLMs dropped, but they already had a sense of how much change this could cause. So basically they're trying to make a point here, which is there are going to be regions of work within the physical jobs and in the cognitive jobs that are relatively safe for a time, right? So on the physical axis, the ones that are going to fare the worst will be in this block here, the very mechanical jobs and the very asocial jobs, because those will be the easiest ones to roboticize and automate. In the cognitive jobs, the ones that are going to be the worst off are the ones that are very routine and very asocial, right? So the ones that are basically crunching the numbers, doing things like that. So anyway, they do say that humans will have the upper hand on AI for a very long time in terms of 3 central traits: creativity, empathy, and then like really intuitive dexterity, right? Sure, there are already robots doing surgeries and things like that, but many of them were programmed rule for rule by people or are still operated by people behind some sort of computer board. It's going to be hard to get that to be intuitive for the machine itself. So all of that is to say, like, look, there's probably a major shift coming for people in these other quadrants here, right? And so one thing we want to be thinking about in probably the short term, definitely the medium term, is how we can retrain people, et cetera. I'm going to come back to this under what Bostrom labels as the purpose problem. So we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so 2 big kind of philosophical problems with AI are not specific to AI, but they are highly relevant to AI. The first one is the alignment problem. I'll get to why I have Microsoft Clippies there. I'm sure there's some copyright infringement there or something, but Clippies there in a moment. But the alignment problem is thinking about, how do the human goals that we're trying to achieve through the use of AI and the human methods that we would use, maybe I could say absent AI or something, how do they translate into the AI itself? In other words, what happens when AI develops its own methods for doing things and potentially even its own goals, right? So really when we talk about the alignment problem, we're talking about a potential misalignment problem. People who talk about this problem do use parallels in human life, right? So when we talk about the control problem and 2 agency problem, we'll essentially say like, okay, well, you can have 2 human agents that might be misunderstanding one another, and then that creates a kind of problem, right? So really the artificial intelligence alignment problem is one of scale, and I'll get to an example of that in a second. So because we don't really know, I'll skip ahead 1 second here. So even Sam Altman at OpenAI, Dario Amati at Claude, Anthropic, I should say, they've all acknowledged that the neural network model that the LLMs use is very black box-like, right? They've trained it and they've given it various weights, right? But once we're at the point where we're releasing it into the wild, so to speak, we know the inputs and we know the outputs. We don't know how the model got from the inputs to the outputs, right? And this is kind of a universal problem. Anthropic has spent a little bit more time and money, certainly money, than OpenAI and some of the other companies in trying to figure this out a little bit, but it's still very much a problem. This was a little while ago, but the tech writer Megan O'Giblin, I think, I don't know that she came up with this number. It was based on some researcher she was interviewing, but she pointed out that in order to get from the inputs to the outputs, and even a relatively simple LLM query, you would print out about 900 billion, I think she said, printer pages of data, right? So even if we wanted to do that, we wouldn't have enough time in our lives, like our lifespan, to be able to read that many pages for one query, right? So that's what's back there. So because of those considerations, Noah Yuval Harari, it's written some fabulous stuff on history and society and information, has said AI should really stand for alien intelligence, because what's inside that black box, we just don't know. We don't know how it, quote unquote, thinks, right? which is probably being generous, but that's okay. So the alignment problem. So I think a really good kind of story that gives an example of the alignment problem outside of the AI context is the one about asking a genie for world peace. Has anyone here heard this one before? Okay, so you get this wish from a genie. Genie says, I'll give you whatever you want. So the person asks for world peace. Next thing you know, all the humans disappear from the planet, right? So, the asker had really good intentions. The genie probably was trying to do this the most efficient way possible, but clearly there was a misalignment between the intentions and what the genie wound up doing, right? So Bostrom, I actually like this example more than Bostrom's, but Bostrom's is much more practical to AI, and here's why I have Clippy. Bostrom imagines us asking AI to maximize paper clip production, which itself is a little absurd because you'd presume in a technologically mature society we wouldn't have so much paper, but okay. So I'm working at a paperclip factory. I ask my AI to maximize paperclip production. Okay. So the first thing it does is it really streamlines the process within the factory equipment that exists, right? The next thing it does is it sort of hires people and other robots to begin disassembling the factory equipment itself to use it as raw materials to make more paper clips. Then it does the building, then it does the village, and then it does everything on the entire planet, right? So now we have more paper clips on the planet than we could ever have imagined ever wanting, but we have nothing else, right? And there it has maximized paper clips, right? But obviously it did so in a way that the factory manager did not intend to have happen. So that's like one major problem underlying the physical threat of AI is just that we would even have good intentions. The AI doesn't have any malintent, right? It's just the misalignment of what ways we're speaking. And of course, people have already warned us like, oh, the more specific you get on the prompt, the better the output you get. But it's like, okay, but some of these problems are very hard to avoid. Okay, so how could we control AI? So this has to do with what Bostrom calls the two-agency problem. Again, we can imagine a sort of human versus human one. So like if you're in an industry that works with clients a lot, or even as a teacher, right? You sort of like have expectations for your students, and they might give you something completely different, right? And it's like, oh, it's because maybe I wasn't clear enough in my instructions, or maybe it's just the fact they didn't work hard enough or whatever, right? But it's, so when you have two agents, it's much more difficult. Now, this is, of course, exacerbated extensively by the human AI problem. So look, there's like physical ways to maybe shut things down. One way of doing this would be through, I'll jump ahead, sorry, through capability control, which is like, okay, if what we're concerned about are servers communicating, right, or the sort of AI communicating outside of its box. Of course, right now AI is not very boxed up at all, so there's something about that. But then we could put on what's called a Faraday cage, which makes sure that prohibits any wireless transmissions between things, right? Then you could also imagine a motivational control, which is we are setting these things up intentionally to only achieve certain goals, right? So that would have a very strong-handed programming aspect to it. And that'd be another way to do it. Okay, so those are kind of like the philosophical problems that pertain to physical existential risks. And of course, even the first and second examples I gave of those were not meant to be exhaustive, just certain things to think about. Okay, so I'm a little bit more interested in the so-called asymptomatic harms. I'm going to have to do this quickly, sorry. But this has to do more with like our sense of purpose and our sense of a kind of general degradation of our thinking abilities over time because we are slowly giving things that we used to do to AI. So the purpose problem has a kind of like nice valence to it in the sense that it imagines a world in which all of our needs are met, right? So homelessness, not a thing anymore. Hunger, not a thing anymore. Sort of resource needs, not a thing anymore. All the energy becomes green and renewable on smart grids, and we all just live ostensibly, on paper, right, wonderful lives, okay? So his thing, he does first look at the job thing. He says, like, look, okay, we have to talk about shallow redundancy, in which like AI will just replace all of our jobs. And maybe then we can imagine something like a universal basic income structure. Lee and Chifan talk about 3 Rs. We want to get ahead of this and retrain people recalibrate our vision about what work is. And they have a really nice theory that like the optimistic part of me buys into a little bit, which is like if we shift so much of workaday work to AI, it could in theory permit of a more humanities and arts oriented renaissance, right? We now have so much more kind of cognitive bandwidth and time and wherewithal to be working on projects of creation and artistry as opposed to products for work or whatever, right? So that's a kind of nice vision of what could happen. But the deep redundancy is a little more scary because what if AI also replaces everything else we find meaningful, right? Now, look, there's good arguments that like hobbies are always going to be hobbies. He and other philosophers call these autotelic, which essentially means they are their own ends. We do them because we enjoy them for what we're doing, not because of some other product, right? But certainly for those who are at like the head of their particular discipline field, whatever, the athletes, the musicians, whatever, it could be a little bit demoralizing to have computers and robots be better at you than whatever it is you can do, right? So there's that potential problem there, and he gives a number of ways we can get to that, but I'm going to point to some more near-term potential problems. So with cognitive offloading, I think a nice kind of philosophical example here is in the work of German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel. Part of his story of how our own kind of soul or personality, he calls it spirit, develops is in this struggle between essentially dominance and submission. He calls it master and servant. And, to this day, people debate like, oh, is Hegel talking about two distinct people or is he talking about two aspects of our own consciousness? It doesn't matter so much, I think, for the point I'm trying to make here. But in this story, the master gives all of the duties to the servant and the servant sort of follows those demands, right? What Hegel wants to point out is that the servant actually slowly accumulates power in taking over the tasks of the master, such that at some point they could revolt, right? Because they now have all the know-how about how to do everything, okay? So the master thinks they're in charge, but they're only in charge until the servant stands up and says, well, wait a second, I can do everything you do. So why am I still, listening to your instructions? So cognitive offloading has a similar sort of structure to that, right? The basic idea is that we're unloading these mental tasks that we would have previously done ourselves to other technologies, and then we lose the ability to sort of do those ourselves, right? I don't know if you've encountered this, but when I ask my students to write by hand, the spelling's not very good anymore, okay? And I think part of the reason is because, and me too, I think all of us do this, we've given so much of our thinking about how words are spelled to spell checkers that we don't have to do that anymore ourselves. So Skynet here is a reference to the Terminator world where machines completely take over. I'm saying like, hey, even if we don't get that far, what happens when we relinquish all of our thinking to AI? So Patricia Taylor, writing in Inside Higher Ed, and there have been numerous other op-eds about this elsewhere, but I thought she did a really nice job of kind of concisely stating this case. She points out like, look, in a world where students are almost solely using AI to create long-form written assignments, and some, not all, I know us in the room don't do this, right? Some professors are using AI to grade those assignments. It's like, what are we doing here, right? Because then there's a closed circuit of AI only interacting with AI, right? And Arendt, so a lot of the background theory here, I'm sorry, I couldn't put it all in the presentation because there's so much, but a lot of my background thinking is developed on various points Arendt has made in the past, Hannah Arendt. She says, human beings only make sense in talking to each other. I can't make sense to an AI. An AI can't really, it can make sense to me. I suppose that's on the receptive end. But it's only in beings that sort of have that meaning and have sense that can make sense to one another. So when AI is speaking to itself, the presumption is it cannot make sense to itself. Thereby, meaning is kind of evacuated from the whole process. So another concern would be false mastery, very much related to cognitive offloading. But imagine a process of training where you become like an expert at whatever it is you're doing, but you're so heavily relying on technologies to get there that if those technologies should fail, you would have no idea how to be an expert in that particular area. So I'm going to jump ahead here and talk about one radiology study where these were trained radiologists, right? So they were very used to spending minutes, if not hours, looking at x-rays, trying to determine what's going on there, and they got very good at it. But you introduce AI programs to essentially identify problem areas, then the experts who do have this experience, so this is not newbies, right? Only look at the areas that the AI indicates, right? And they actually have missed things that the AI missed because they had already trained themselves to only look at the things that AI points out, right? So now imagine if that happens with someone who was never fully trained on an extensive career of looking at x-rays, right? But only knows how to use the AI programs to do this, and you can imagine the problem that creates. Another thing to think about here is agency decay. So I would say right now there's a bunch of research out there, more psychological than philosophical, that makes the argument that in a kind of robust consumer society like our own, or you think even of streaming platforms or social media platforms or whatever, think even of AI models that you could possibly use, there are so many choices out there. And so people point out like, oh, this kind of hyper choice actually degrades our ability to make thoughtful decisions about important things because we are basically using up the bandwidth of our choice, of our choosing and decision making on much smaller matters that don't actually matter that much, right? So that's kind of a current problem. I think the future problem would be that our agency would decay because we're defaulting to AI to make all important decisions in our lives, right? Decisions about nutrition, decisions about exercise, decisions about career, decisions about therapy with our significant others or families or whatever, right? And then we're unable to kind of make those decisions for ourselves. So others have called this intuition rust and kind of a lack of trust in oneself. I have to admit, having it's so dumb, but I will confess publicly of having that kind of reaction. I sleep with my watch on and my watch gives me sleep data, and having that kind of reaction in the morning of like, you know, how do I feel right now, and checking my sleep metrics as if that could indicate to me how good of a sleep did I get, right? How well rested I feel. I've outsourced it to the metrics on my watch, which is really stupid. So I try not to let myself do that. But so Kant, I think, pointed this out, close to 250 years ago now. He says, you know, he's entering this essay contest about what is enlightenment, right? And he says, enlightenment is human's emergence from their self-imposed immaturity, okay? Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another, right? So here the other wouldn't be like the priest or the politician or even the kind of charismatic professor or whatever. Here the other would be the robot, right? The AI that is replacing that guidance, okay? He even like acknowledges way back then, very smart guy, saying like, oh, well, generally speaking, the average person would rather pay to have something done for them than do it themselves. And it just seems very much like the kind of format of what's going on with AI. Oops, sorry, wrong animations there. But okay, so I know we are quickly running out of time here, but this is kind of the last point I wanted to make. Okay, so I think Arendt, she's probably not alone in this, but I think a really interesting insight of hers is that thinking as we understand it is a proper moment of contemplation, right, is going to happen outside of time. Not literally, of course, it could take seconds or minutes to think through a problem, right? But it's going to interrupt the flow of whatever process we've started, right? Hence, we have this notion of stopping and thinking, right? Stop and think about that, right? So her like kind of best, she doesn't really define it anywhere, but her best kind of indication of what the shape of thoughtlessness looks like is the inability to explore something from an alternate perspective, right? So I'm just kind of like going with the flow. I'm not able to step outside of this to determine what it looks like from another position, right? One thing that technologies, all the tech gurus, CEOs right now, they all want speed, right? And the whole point of the effective technology is frictionlessness, right? No friction. Just keep moving forward, make it easy for the consumer, keep the companies going. You know, you could get into the problem of short-termism, and quarterly earnings and all of that as well. But the question is, when everything is frictionless, when do we stop and think? Right? So that's sort of the key problem here. So this is a rough and ready definition, but the idea of technological thoughtlessness would be the inability to imagine a perspective outside of one's, possessive should not be there, outside of one's given by trusted technologies, right? So I'm always defaulting to Google for the answer to my research. I'm always defaulting to ChatGPT for the answer to my, questions about, I don't know, therapy or something, right? I'm always defaulting to these things. So I want to make it clear that, like, I think that AIs can have a positive, like, use value in our lives. Really, what we always need to keep in mind is a kind of balance, right? Between still being able to gain experience of our own, take a critical thinking position of our own, and really making sure that we maintain some level of mastery. Not for mastery's sake, but so that we could do these things absent the AI, right? And I kind of see the direction that we're moving in, especially with the younger generations, because there isn't really a big plan that we've all gotten together to agree upon, right? As maybe going a little bit too far in the direction of relying on the AIs. I'm going to skip this point for now. I did want to end on a somewhat positive note. I'm not going to read all of this, but this is Jack Clark of Anthropic. And I thought, like, this was a really positive use case of AI for, it has its limitations, don't get me wrong, but a positive use case of AI for the kind of thoughtfulness, right? So I'll quickly summarize this. He's basically having a conflict with another person at work. He types in the conflict and asks Claude to say, hey, what are some things this other person could be thinking, right? Like, help me expand, my perspective here. He points out that's not a case where I'm using technology to affirm my beliefs or show I'm in the right, but actually to help me try and sit with how this other person is experiencing the situation. So fast forward a little bit. He says, like, look, even if it's not correct, the sort of viewpoint that Claude gave back to the Jack Clark who's doing this inquiry, when I tell this to people that I've gone through this step, they appreciate that I've even attempted to understand what they might be thinking, right? So it's not so much that the AI is right or wrong, but that the AI can be a bridge to dialogue with another human being in this case, right? Note that Jack Clark is not saying, oh, I took what the AI told me and didn't talk to this person, right? No, but I took what might be the case and then raised it with this person. And, so I thought that was interesting. Again, it's not like, oh, it's perfect or something, but all right, so that was a lot. I wanted to leave time for questions, and I'm happy for you to bring up anything I talked about, or even things I didn't talk about. So, yeah. All right. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Kudos on your choice of neckwear.
Thank you very much. You gave it to me, so thanks. Yeah.
Just one observation on the off-putting question. I noticed, like, I gather in pro cycling, which we both follow, team directors won't tell the riders they're sleep debt. They want to know, because people be, oh God, I'm screwed today. Like,
yeah. Yeah.
I was really cheered by the last, maybe a positive, and there was this thing called Sway.
Yeah.
Is that? I mean, I think that idea of helping, I think it's something to help students, especially in college students, develop an appreciation for others' perspectives. Is there?
Yeah. So I probably don't know. So the question was, to what extent are there existing, I'm sorry, I'm putting words in your mouth here, but to what extent are there existing AI models that really focus on this other perspective and attempt to, like, engender that other perspective? And Sean is referring to Sway.ai, which I believe was developed by 2 philosophy professors. But this is an AI model where the point is to take a quote unquote hot button issue and then essentially discuss it with the AI with an intent to understand positions from the other side. And, so, like, an absolutist here would say, oh, that's so silly, we should just be talking to other people. And I guess my point would be, but we don't. Right? We don't talk to other people about issues that they disagree with us on, for the most part, right? And so this is a nice bridge, right? This is getting them thinking about what the other side might be thinking about in those cases. I saw another similarly sort of situated idea. I think there was a New York op-ed written up about this about a year ago or so. Someone came up with DebunkBot, and what DebunkBot is a place that people who are kind of pulled in by a particular conspiracy theory can go to have the AI kind of test the conspiracy theory. And research on DebunkBot has shown that it does change a fair amount of minds, right? Not everyone who uses it, but it does have some success in changing people's minds. So, you know, I'm sure way back when we all read that popular mechanics debunking of the 9/11 was an inside job idea that this was explosives or something. And so what the debunk bot does is like basically gather that information and ask the person more questions to get them thinking about why their position might be wrong. So I think Sway and DebunkBot are like two models that are really interesting in this regard of like testing our own perspective and trying to see other ones. Yeah.
It's especially interesting with DebunkBot
Mm-hmm.
because it seems to me people would give AI a kind of neutrality and authority.
I think that
imagine someone not being persuaded by another human being,
right,
doing much of what DebunkBot was doing. So there's also it's an interesting advantage it might have.
I kind of agree with that. Now, whether or not we ought to be giving AI a position of neutrality, but I mean, I do agree that there's hope, right? That it can kind of break through a very polarized and fragmented media ecosystem. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts?
Any questions?
Okay.
I just sort of had a follow-up question. You mentioned that there's sort of this black box around, there's an input and there's an output, and
Right.
what happens in the middle is a little squishy.
Right.
And I guess that's a little surprising to me because in my thinking, a human created some
Sure.
functions and formulas that are getting from A to B.
Sure.
But it sounds like it's murkier than that.
Much murkier. So basically the way it would go, and I'm sure there would be people in computer science who can explain this much better than I can, but the way that it basically works is the kind okay, so apparently this first appeared back in the 60s, and then people were like, no, that's not gonna work. And then it got taken up again hugely in the 90s and 2000s. And that was basing the idea of a learning machine on essentially the structure of the brain and the way that our neurons work in the brain, right? So it's not literally based in gray matter, right? It's all in silicon chips, but the gist is it's kind of working in a similar way. So what this meant was, the belief was at least, and it appears to be working so far, is that we can train the model to learn, right? And we do that by giving it a bunch of images, and we say, this one is a cat, this one is not a cat. This one is a cat, this one is not a cat. This one is a cat, this one is a cat, this one is a cat, this one is not a cat. And for a long time, there was a lot of training going on, right? And apparently there's some human workers' rights stuff going on there too, because like people in Nigeria were being paid slave wages to just tap cat, no cat, whatever, not good stuff. But they got the models to a point, and this was the whole point of it, the exercise, where like they'd put a cat in front of it, and the model would determine whether or not it was a cat, right? And so the model then begins to use its own experience and data to essentially come up with, produce outputs on its own. And I guess we never really knew what was going on even when we trained it, but now we really don't know what's going on when it gets things right, right? And it still can't get things wrong. So the algorithm idea works very similarly to the reason that a Spotify or a Netflix would want you to hit thumbs up or thumbs down on a particular song or a particular show. Namely, it gives additional weights in the algorithm to things that are like that, and probably gives lower weights to things that are not like that. And so the next suggestion is going to be even better because, yeah, maybe. Exactly. I know. No, I went into this long thing in class the other day about how the best music algorithm I ever encountered was bought by Apple prior to their even launching Apple Music streaming. So that was like 30 years ago now, but yeah. So thanks, great question. Yeah, did that make sense? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it is crazy. The machine learning aspect is crazy. So yeah. Oh yeah, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.